Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for today's lecture, we are going to we're going to continue diving into the action, and we're going to look at the middle years of the United States Civil War. But before we begin our lecture proper, I'd like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed the battles of Shiloh, Second Manassas or Second Bull Run, and how the war was shifting. So we saw that in the West, Ulysses Grant, was very successful. He was defeating his Confederate foes with ease. But that was sort of checked and balanced by Robert E. Lee's and the Army of Northern Virginia unparalleled success against all the commanders put in place of the Army of the Potomac. At this point in the war, the Army of the Potomac was really just the whipping boy of the of the Army of Northern Virginia. They had not been able to really withstand any of the attacks or even defense or even break the defenses of the Army of Northern Virginia. And the war sort of just swung back and forth between the East and the West. But the actions in the West really didn't factor into the opinions of most of the people living in the United States or the Confederate States, or even foreign observers in Europe and Latin America. They all tended to focus on Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And really, the greatest successes and the greatest impotence for granting recognition and openly conducting deals with the Confederate States rested on the ability of the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee to successfully and successively defeat the Army of the Potomac and the cadre of officers appointed to command them. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture. And so, in the summer of 1862 and the autumn of 1863, the Confederate States began a series of counteroffensives that seemed to ensure a decisive and favorable outcome of the war for the war. In the East, Robert E. Lee gathered his forces and invaded the United States state of Maryland in September of 1862. After the Battle of Second Manassas, Lee was on a roll, and he really wanted to press his advantage. A number of opportunities had opened for Lee. He was the most audacious commander of the United States Civil War and had consistently looked to grab the initiative in all contests. Lee, in the Maryland campaign of 1862, wanted to remove the theater of combat from Virginia, particularly Northern Virginia, which has suffered greatly in the preceding months, as the United States forces and the Confederate forces sort of ate off the land. It was a really hard time for farmers and large-scale slave owners in Northern Virginia. The armies would come through and pick their fields clean, and there was really nothing they can do. The soldiers would simply come in and pick fruit from the trees, or dig up the vegetables, or even just take their animals to slaughter for food. So they really couldn't catch their breath, and Lee wanted to take that the demoralization and debilitation that that was being inflicted on Northern Virginia and move it to the north to further increase Northern war discontent. Now, the United States were forced to play catch up and guess Lee's intentions as a means to make up for being at a I guess, initiative disadvantage, for being at that disadvantage. They were forced to play catch up with him. And another reason for Lee's invasion was that 1862 was an election year. Lee wanted to influence. He wanted to put pressure on the United States political system. He wanted to particularly influence the voters of the lower tier of free states, the butternut counties, by using a show of force. He also wanted to. He also knew that if he was successful in his invasion of Maryland, he, along with a number of other Confederates, were under the impression that they would be able to liberate Maryland from the United States. Many people in the Confederate States thought that Maryland was being forcibly kept in the United States. And of course, a positive outcome in this campaign would further the influence of the Confederate States on the European states. It would open further diplomatic relations for the Confederate States. It would be a diplomatic godsend if Lee was successful. Now, the campaign began with the movement of the Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River. And moving into western Maryland, Thomas Jackson, also known as Stonewall Jackson, took a portion of Lee's army and captured the United States garrison at Harper's Ferry. He took some 12,000 men when he did that. Now, George McClellan, the commander of the United States Army of the Potomac, came into possession of Lee's strategic plans for the Maryland campaign. McClellan, with this great momentous shift, could have inflicted unknown damage onto the Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan, however, moved slowly and failed to fully capitalize on his opportunity. Now, this allowed Lee to regroup his forces and challenge McClellan at Antietam or Sharpsburg on September 17, 1862. This will be the bloodiest single day in United States history. More than 23,000 casualties were inflicted. Lee retreated after the battle, heading back towards Virginia the very next day. With this retreat, the military and political aims of the invasion of Maryland came to a swift and abrupt end. With that being said, it was not seen as a great victory in the United States or in Europe at the time. McClellan did not follow up on the victory or the successful stand at Antietam. He did not put pressure on Lee during his retreat and simply allowed Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia to return to Virginia unharassed. McClellan had upwards of 83,000 men, and Lee had about half that amount due to desertion and casualties from the campaign. Now, in the West, the Confederates were mounting an offensive campaign under Braxton Bragg. Bragg was planning on moving through Tennessee and Kentucky in September and October of 1862. Bragg also hoped to relieve pressure on the local farmers and slave plantations by moving the theater of war out of their general location, out of their local surroundings. He wanted to also give them some breathing space, some breathing room, so that the local economy could recover. Like Lee, he thought that Kentucky was being held in the United States by the point of a bayonet. Bragg also hoped to reverse the results of Grant's campaign of the previous campaign season. He also wanted to influence the politics of Kentucky. As a matter of fact, Braxton Bragg had a Confederate governor installed at the city of Frankfort. His appointee did not have actual political control of the state. He was merely a symbolic symbol. It was really just a symbolic gesture by the Confederacy via Braxton Bragg. At the outset of his campaign, it was like, well, I'm here, we're going to win. Kentucky's now going to be a Confederate state. Here's our Confederate governor. His campaign will come to an end at the Battle of Perryville. And Perryville was fought, the Battle of Perryville was fought on October 8th, 1862. Don Carlos Buell came into contact with a portion of Bragg's army and really just forced that army, Braxton Bragg, into a tactical stalemate. But Bragg didn't have enough troops to really fight off Buell. The numbers are 22,000 for Buell and 16,000 for Bragg. Bragg left. He was forced to retreat and leave Kentucky after the Battle of Perryville. And in doing so, the Confederates found themselves in this sort of dismal situation in which their two big offensives, the Maryland and the Kentucky campaigns of 1862, came to nothing, and they were at even more of a disadvantage than they were before that. And Buell, for his part, did not follow up his victory like McClellan in Maryland. He simply allowed Bragg to leave. Now, looking back on these two campaigns in 1862, militarily, the campaigns were failures. The invasions were failures for the Confederate States. They both ended in defeat with no successful gains, no real show of force. Now, the lack of exploitation by the United States commanders severely limits the scope of the military victories or the military achievements of the United States in these campaigns. Now, this led the United States and Confederate States to view these campaigns as limited setbacks rather than complete failures. Now, diplomatically speaking, Antietam was a great success for the United States. Lee's retreat made the British and the French back away from recognizing the Confederate States, not only because of the defeat, but because of Abraham Lincoln borrowing a page from Robert E. Lee's playbook, took the initiative. He took the initiative by adding to the United States war aims freedom and emancipation for the entire, well, not the entire, but he put that on the on the books officially by issuing his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and he did this 5 days after Antietam on September 22nd of 1862. Now, in the United Kingdom and France, the war now became a struggle to preserve the federal republic, and it became an anti-slavery crusade. It was not really seen that way in the United States, and there was a lot of opposition in the United States to adding emancipation to the list of war goals. But for Europe, the Emancipation Proclamation had the effect of making this a struggle to preserve the federal republic and to end slavery in the United States. Now, it made foreign aid essentially a non-reality, a non-viable option for the Confederate States. Another effect of the campaigns was that Lee was now the general. He was now officially the general that the Confederate government and the Confederate civilian population looked to provide battlefield success, something no other Confederate general would achieve during the war. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia will become the most recognizable national institution of the Confederate States. They will really be the heartbeat of the Confederate States from this point on. Now, in the United States, there was great. Lincoln was he was continuing the trend that he had of replacing generals. Lincoln, when you examine the Civil War, you find that Lincoln was really meddlesome in this regard. He overly analyzed, and he really played shuffle the deck. You know, if a general lost the battle, he replaced the general just like that. We saw that in our last lectures with the rotating of Joseph Hooker, George McClellan, and Ambrose Burnside from command of the Army of the Potomac. They did not give Lincoln the result that he wanted, and Lincoln pulled them from the field. You don't find this sort of instability in the Confederate States. You know, generals are, even though Jefferson Davis was meddlesome as well, generals were, once they were in the field, they were given command of their troops, and they were allowed to lead campaigns that they saw fit without any real fear of their job security. In the United States, Lincoln was known for just pulling people from their position. He did not. You did not really have job security as far as Lincoln was concerned, and this is reflective in examining the aftermath of the campaigns of 1862. For example, Lincoln had McClellan and Buell relieve the command. He replaced them with William Rosecrans in the West, and Ambrose Burnside came to prominence in the East. Both men knew that they were supposed to produce results, and both men went on to produce some varied results between December and January of 1863. To begin with, we'll look at Rosecrans in the West. Rosecrans moved against Bragg and clashed with him at Murfreesboro or Stones River. Now, this was a very bloody engagement. More than 1/3 of the men from both sides died in this battle. In the end, Bragg was forced to retreat again, and Rosecrans, like his predecessor, did not follow up. And also in the West happening at this time, you had Ulysses S. Grant, who was at this time trying to capture the citadel of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. Now, this was a major war plan, and this was a leftover from the Anaconda Plan created by Winfield Scott at the war's onset. Now, the Vicksburg Citadel sat between Memphis and Baton Rouge on the Mississippi River. There were considerable Confederate defensive works in place, and Grant wanted to move against Vicksburg both on land, heading towards the citadel from Tennessee, and both from the east. He would be coming in from the north. He would be making that dive south from Tennessee, and from the east he had William Sherman commanding a very sizable contingent of his forces coming in from the east to apply the pressure that way. They couldn't really come in from the south, and they couldn't really come in from the west because of the river. Well, they would later come in from the west with aid from a naval contingent, but Grant really wanted to put the land pressure on. He came in through both of the land routes, the land options that he had, the north and the east. But the pressure that he wanted to apply really didn't come into play. It really didn't come to any effect. The siege of Vicksburg began in December of 1862, and it lasted throughout 1863. The campaign ended it looked like the campaign was going to end dismally. Nothing that Grant tried succeeded. From December to March and early April, many people thought that this campaign was going to fail. The Confederates were holding strong. By this time, the naval contingent was in place, and they were continually shelling the fortifications at Vicksburg from the Mississippi River. Sherman was holding his own on the east, and of course Grant, and his main command had locked everything down from the north, directly coming from the direction of Tennessee onto Vicksburg. And with that, we'll break and we'll cut our lecture here, and we'll come back to finish off in part 2 of the middle years to the Civil War. As always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture, and I'll see you next time for another lecture.